Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Inside Legal ESG podcast series. My name is Pamela Cohn, and I'm delighted to serve as host for this podcast series. Today, our guest is Kristina Wyatt, Deputy General Counsel and Chief Sustainability Officer at Persephone.
Hi,
welcome,
Pam.
Kristina. How are you? We're so excited to have you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, let's dive right in because I would love to hear about your career and how you ended up at Persephone.
Great. Well, it goes back a long time. I've been on Earth for a little while. So I started my career as a securities lawyer because that was sort of the job that was available when I came out of law school. I will say I've always been interested in sustainability. I helped to found a international environmental law and policy journal in law school. But at the time I graduated, there were no jobs that were appealing to me in sustainability or environmental law. So I became a securities lawyer, which ended up being great because as it happens, I love securities law. And I think it's really important to the work that we're trying to do now in sustainability. So I worked at a firm, I worked in a company in-house, and then I went to the Securities and Exchange Commission round one, where I ended up working in the Division of Corporation Finance, which is the division that reviews companies' filings and works on rules related to what companies need to disclose. And then ultimately worked for a commissioner, had a great job right after Enron and WorldCom and during the implementation of Sarbanes-Oxley. So such an exciting, fun time. And then I had kids and went home for a few years to take care of them, which was probably the hardest job that I've ever had, but also the most rewarding. And then came back into the workforce in a capacity that enabled me to have sufficient flexibility to be home with my kids when they needed me and be at school, et cetera. So I came back in-house at Latham & Watkins and was doing commercial transactions work. And over time, I became hungry for more. I wasn't sort of sufficiently enthralled with the work that I was doing. And so ultimately, I ended up kind of convincing the firm to let me start a sustainability program that ended up having three components to it. It was focused on our operational sustainability, our pro bono practice, and our commercial practice, building a sustainable or an ESG practice. So, and then along the way, Latham was nice enough to let me go back to school and get my MBA in sustainability, which I did. So it was, busy times for a couple of years, still raising kids and working my then two jobs at Latham and getting my MBA, but enormously rewarding ultimately, and really loved that experience. And once I had my MBA, I sort of convinced the firm that I should be able to pivot out of my normal day job and just focus on sustainability, which I did. And then along the way, I came to know Allison Heron-Lee, who after President Biden was elected, became the acting chair of the SEC. And she asked me to come over to work on the climate rule. And it took me about 3 seconds to say, yes, of course. And, she laughed and said, well, do you want to talk to Latham or your kids or, your family, anybody? And I was like, no, this is just what I want to do. Yeah, absolutely. So went over to the SEC just on a 1-year assignment. And that was an amazing experience and very much aligned with what I thought needed to happen in that we were seeing more and more companies reporting on ESG. We were seeing more and more investors asking for ESG information, but there was a real fragmentation in the reporting landscape. Most of the reporting that was being done was voluntary, and there was what people call an alphabet soup of different standards that people were trying to figure out, how to make sense of in order to craft their disclosures. And so there was a real need for harmonization and regulation. And so going to the SEC to work on crafting rules to help to create that lane of travel, and also working with the international community, working with other regulators to try to figure out what is the appropriate lane of travel? What should we require companies to report so that we could create consistency and help companies to be able to provide information to investors that would really be useful to them, and also help companies to think about their climate related financial risks and start to manage them. So I was at the SEC for my 1-year assignment and rather thought I would go back to Latham & Watkins, but I was talking with my friend Bob Eccles, and he was on the Persephone Sustainability Advisory Board, and he suggested that I talk to Persephone, and so I did, and I quickly came to see it was sort of like the Allison moment where it was like, well, I'm doing that, so I don't need to fret over it too much. And the reason that I was so compelled by Persephone is that once we had established what the rules of the road would be, what the disclosure rules would be, the next big challenge clearly was going to be how to make it easier for companies to report, to provide tools to enable companies to have confidence in their greenhouse gas emissions data, to take what was a pretty complex exercise that was typically being done by consultants on spreadsheets in a way that wasn't necessarily as reliable as companies needed the information to be. And software really solves for that. And so I was pretty captivated by Persephone from the beginning. I thought, okay, this is the next thing that we need, is software that can really help companies to gather their information, their greenhouse gas emissions data in a way that was more reliable and that was less painful. That's a long story. I'm sorry, Pam.
It's a fascinating story. And I noticed that your title at Persephone is, both Deputy General Counsel and Chief Sustainability Officer. Was that the shape of the role when you first started talking to them, or did you combine those things in conversations with them?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was always going to come into the legal department because there's a philosophy here that I think is correct, that all the lawyers should report into the general counsel. We have an amazing general counsel, Peter Bartolino, and all the lawyers in the organization report up to Peter. But it happened that a lot of my interest and expertise and ability to provide value kind of crossed over between legal and more policy work, more sustainability work, helping to ensure that the product properly incorporates the regulatory developments that were emerging, speaking about the regulatory developments, helping to inform our customers and potential customers in the world about sort of what the direction of travel was. So the role itself was always something that was something of a hybrid. Although I didn't come in with the Chief Sustainability Officer role, I had a different title, but it still had sustainability in it. It was something like Senior Vice President of Global Regulatory Policy or something like that. It was too long.
Yeah. Well, I think it's very telling, and I think a lot of companies are starting to commingle, if not combine, a legal component and the sustainability component, because they are so related. You mentioned that early on you've always been interested in sustainability. Can you trace that back to what triggered that? Is it something in your youth, or is it something you read about in high school or college, or how did you come to be so interested and passionate about sustainability?
Honestly, I think, like a lot of people, I enjoyed the outdoors. I enjoyed nature, and it probably didn't come from my youth because I grew up on the sidewalks of New York City. So, although, also a lot of time in Central Park. But after college, during college, I spent time in the Shenandoah Mountains, in the Blue Ridge Mountains, on rivers, and ultimately went out to Colorado with some friends, and it just kind of fell in love with it.
And want to preserve it, right? For your kids and kids. And
yeah, absolutely.
So given the focus and also the politicization of ESG, what topics are front and center for you right now in your role at Persephone?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I've really seen an evolution of kind of where we focus over
Mhm.
the course of the last couple of years, and that has tracked to some extent with uh, regulatory developments, but also market developments. So we're seeing, I think, healthy developments in this field, in that a couple of years ago, there was a sense that, okay, we have these regulations coming down the pike. We've got to make sense of them and, figure out what they require. And then we had a moment where the SEC rule was in litigation, as it still is, was stayed as it still is. And there was a sense of, and there was all the ESG backlash. And so there was a sense of a little bit of hesitancy, sort of paralysis. But now I think we're starting to see the other end of that. And that's driven in part by regulatory developments. We have the California laws, SB 253 and SB 261, that are coming down the pike. We have CSRD in Europe that's going to impact many companies throughout the world.
Mhm.
We have a lot of countries that are incorporating their ISSB standards into their own standards. So there's this sense of inevitability to the reporting requirements. And happily, there's also still that common direction of travel. CSRD, of course, is broader than the ISSB standards, than the SEC in California. It covers a broader swath of topics and approaches sustainability from a double materiality lens. So it's quite a bit different. But when you're focused just on climate and the financial materiality lens, even the CSRD aligns pretty well with the rest of the standards around the world. So I think there's a sort of settling into that common direction of travel. And there's also increasing industry pressure. So the private ordering process continues, but it's continuing in a way that is more harmonized, because we know what companies are going to have to report. So it doesn't feel like the sort of frenetic fragmentation that we had, say, back in 2020. It feels like we're all moving down the same road. And that's starting to build. I'm feeling that momentum building. And the other thing that I think is really positive, and it goes back to your point about that sort of cross-pollination between
Mhm.
legal and sustainability, I think we're seeing more cross-functional collaboration. And we're seeing it also with the finance department and sustainability, which is quite interesting. So, all of these critical functions need to be part of the conversation. And I think we're seeing governance processes developing where we do have greater sort of cross-fertilization and communication. And that's all to the good.
I completely agree. And I think it takes the whole village, the whole business, to be on a sustainability journey. It's not a single person's job by any
Yeah.
means. One of the things I'm hearing when I'm talking to companies and all of these emerging regulatory requirements is that there's a sense of frustration that the whole job has suddenly become reporting and meeting reporting requirements rather than affecting the change and moving the needle on what the company is doing. What's your sense of the resources required for all of this reporting, all of these reporting requirements, and is it taking our eye off the ball?
That's such a great question. So as of late, maybe the last month or 6 weeks, I've become obsessed with this new role of the ESG controller that seems to be emerging kind of everywhere. And I talked with my friend Ellen Weinreb about this at Greenfin or Greenbiz, I think it was Greenfin. And so she's a recruiter in the sustainability space. And so it's very interesting to get her insights.
Mhm.
And she articulated two insights that I think are really compatible. They're sort of two sides of the same coin. One was that she's seeing a lot of CSOs, chief
Mhm.
sustainability officers, getting burned out,
Mhm. Mhm.
right? And then the other was the emergence of this ESG controller. So someone in the finance group, typically trained in financial controls, who's moving over to encompass, to also include ESG topics in what the ESG controller is looking at, is pulling data together for. And I think that those two trends are really complementary and very interesting in that I think if you take chief sustainability officers and put them in this position of gathering data, ensuring its integrity, trying to apply financial controls to that data, all toward reporting, that can lend to burnout. Because, and this is just a hypothesis, but the hypothesis is that chief sustainability officers want to have a big impact. They want to steer the strategic direction of a company. They want to set broad goals and think about strategies to meet those goals. They want to decarbonize. They want to do all of the things that fall under their remit, including in human capital management and human rights and water use and all of the topics that might be relevant to the company. And if they end up in this role where they're really charged with having to gather all this data, and there's a lot of data, that may lend to their burnout because they're not doing that strategic big picture sort of thinking that they might have thought that they wanted to do. Whereas, so that's the burnout on the CSO side. And then the ESG controller side, if you take people who are financial controllers who really like data, who enjoy setting up controls, processes, procedures to gather data and to ensure its integrity and to think about how to fill data gaps in a way that reflects good processes, sound analytical processes, that person might be better suited to actually gathering the data and thinking about how to report. And so I think that the emergence of the ESG controller is extremely important because this person is likely to be better suited to the job, right? Can arm the decision makers throughout the company with information that they'll need to make those strategic decisions. The ESG controller typically sits within the finance organization. And so I would say, again, sort of a hypothesis, but that person likely has a level of gravitas that and authority that he or she might not have out of the sustainability office. So people will have to listen to him or her. And so this person is sort of well positioned to gather all this data and to share it throughout the organization and to connect the dots among all these different functions, and then to arm people with the data that they need in order to see the big picture and make strategic decisions.
And I completely agree with that. And I think the other added benefit of having a really good ESG controller is it helps those decision makers, whether that's the board or your management committee or whatever, start to look at ESG data with the same rigor and diligence and detail that they do their financials every quarter, right?
Yeah.
Any company that's on a net zero path is not going to get there without setting carbon budgets for the year. And then carbon budgets that are a little bit less for next year and next year and next year. And that really should be monitored on a quarterly, if not every 6-month basis. And right now, there aren't very many companies that are managing their carbon budget as they do their financial budgets, right? But
yes, absolutely. And we're seeing this emerging role just explode. So I think we are getting there. And I think you're exactly right. I think that's exactly what has to happen, that we need to have financial controllers who really can understand the data, can address ESG data with the level of rigor that you would your financial data.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask you to give us a prediction. What do you think? What is your prediction for what ESG will evolve to in the remainder of 2024 and throughout 2025?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's still pretty short term. We're starting to see a lot of companies really dig in and try to gain better control over their data, really understand their data. And I mean, for us, the ESG controller is sort of, it's a perfect partner for us because our software is all about giving companies full control over their data and full transparency. And being able to develop and show their controls over their greenhouse gas data. We're sort of the anti, easy button black box, we're full transparency, but our most successful customers among our sort of large customers are those that have someone who's really willing to dig in and eager to dig in and gather all that data and make use of it and analyze it, as opposed to the customer who might be looking for that sort of easy button black box kind of just show me the number. So, I think that this emergence of the ESG controller and just what we're seeing in our conversations with customers and prospective customers is a greater seriousness about calculating companies' carbon emissions and doing that with a level of rigor that is comparable to the level of rigor that companies use to gather their financial data, and that is already starting to show benefits in terms of not just the integrity of reporting, but giving companies the tools that they need to be able to do that planning to show their year-over-year decarbonization plan. And that's exactly what we want. So in the short term, I think, we're seeing a lot of preparation for reporting, whether to the emerging regulations or because a lot of companies have customers who are asking for this information or investors, and that's starting to really flow down to where, companies need to gather this information. I would also say that, and this is maybe a little self-serving for Persephone, but we're all about democratization of carbon accounting. And so we have a really sophisticated tool that can help companies that are larger enterprises to be able to measure and report their greenhouse gas emissions. But we also recognize that companies have very deep supply chains. There are private equity firms that have small companies in their portfolios. And those smaller companies are not necessarily going to want a big tool that gives them that level of granularity. They might just want sort of a relatively easy tool to help them to just generate their scope 1 and 2 and 3 emissions. And so we've got a free tool that we've just released that is free to anybody who can go on the website and just create an account and use it. And I think that we're already seeing the incredible uptick in use of the tool. And I think that what that's going to do is to, as I was saying, democratize carbon accounting. And so I think we're going to move more and more in the direction of having actual reported data versus the spend-based estimates that companies have typically been using to try to estimate their scope 3 emissions. And again, it's a journey, it's a process. It will take a little bit of time, but I think that is well underway, and we're for sure going to see just more and more companies reporting actual emissions and finding that it's actually not that difficult. I mean, if you go on our free tool, it's actually fun.
I am so pleased to hear that you're offering a free tool, because I think so many companies who don't meet the regulatory thresholds think they don't have to do this. But to your point earlier, the supply chains reach down well beyond the companies that are covered by the regulatory thresholds. So even small suppliers and vendors and small manufacturers who don't meet those thresholds are still going to have to provide their GHGs to their vendors to their customers and clients.
Yeah, absolutely.
So having a free tool is fabulous. I'm going to definitely promote that more. I didn't realize that you were offering that. That's
awesome. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Yeah, and you just go on Persephone.com and you can create an account. And I promise you, I'm so non-computer savvy, and last weekend I was just playing with it, and it's actually really easy and fun. And I sort of created like a faux law firm because I don't have a business, so my footprint is so right. I imagine I was back at Latham and putting the data in, and you download a spreadsheet and you put in your data for your scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. It prompts you, activities that lead to your emissions, and it prompts you with questions, and it's fun.
Well, on that happy note, I'm going to ask you my final question, and it has something to do with fun. What gives you hope? This is a very challenging area to work. We talked earlier about burnout and all this reporting requirements. So given these challenges that we're working under, what gives you hope?
The people I work with and young people and their desire to do this work. I think it's a huge privilege to get to work in climate change or any area where you feel like you're perhaps helping with a problem that you care about, right? I mean, we're not going to solve climate change. That's sort of a myth, but if we can move the needle a little bit, I feel really privileged to be able to do that. And I see all the people that I work with and their passion, and particularly the young people that I talk to who really want to take this on, and that gives me hope. And technology also gives me hope. I believe in Moore's law. I think that we're going to, dramatically increase the transparency that we have about how we're actually creating the emissions that are lending to climate change. And then I think technology is also going to be critical to coming up with solutions to help us to decarbonize.
I think so too. And I think Persephone is going to be and is a big part of that solution. So thank you so much. And thank you for this conversation. It's been engaging and delightful, and I'm sure our audience will appreciate all your insights.
Well, thank you so much, Pam.
Kristina.
Thanks for having me.
Bye-bye.
Bye.